Good evening. My name is Mark Connors. I'm the town planner for the town of Stratham. And part of my role with the town involves working with the planning board to propose amendments, zoning amendments for the ballot in March. And this is something the town can only do once a year. So this process really started at the beginning of last year and continued throughout the year. And because this is something the board can only do annually, it's something that the board spends quite a bit of time on. Most of these amendments are proposed by the board. Occasionally, staff will propose an amendment based on something that we see kind of developing in town. And occasionally a resident or business owner will approach the town with an amendment. But this year, all of the zoning amendments, that's Articles 2 through 10 on the ballot, those are all supported unanimously by the planning board. So I'm going to go through now each of the articles with you and give you a description of why that language is on the ballot and what the rationale for it is. So I'm going to jump right into that, start with Article 2. Article 2 would increase the front setback for properties in the Gateway District. So the Gateway District is Stratham's largest commercial district. It's along Portsmouth Avenue, just after Route 101 is coming to town from Exeter. And the town, several years back, they enacted the Gateway zoning district, and the town really had a vision for the corridor. You'll see there's a small photo there on your screen. Part of the vision for the corridor is really a more village-like environment, something that was more walkable, with the buildings pushed a little bit closer to the street. So actually the zoning currently doesn't have a front setback requirement. You can build right up to the property line. But unfortunately, the corridor as it exists now, it's not quite ready for this type of development. It's quite wide, quite a bit of traffic, and we don't have the infrastructure to support a really kind of dense environment like you see in that photo. And really the emphasis for this came from the development of the dermatology clinic, which is under construction now along Portsmouth Avenue. And the town has received quite a bit of constructive feedback. That building is just a little bit too close to Portsmouth Avenue. And this is something the planning board was aware of when this project was reviewed by the town. But the board didn't feel like they could require a greater setback because this project didn't meet the requirements. So this amendment would change that. It would increase the front setback requirement to at least 20 feet. But because the right-of-way boundary with Portsmouth Avenue varies quite a bit along the corridor, it would require that at least 40 feet be set aside from where the building starts to where the edge of pavement starts in Portsmouth Avenue. And that would provide a space to add landscaping, to include sidewalks, which is something the town is really trying to promote along Portsmouth Avenue to increase the pedestrian connectivity of the district. So that's part of the rationale behind this amendment. It would require buildings be pushed back further from the street than you'll see, for example, at that dermatology clinic. So that's Article 2 in a nutshell. Article 3 also speaks to front setbacks, but in this case, it's the professional residential district. So that's a small district in Stratham. It's also along Portsmouth Avenue, but it's north of the intersection with Bunker Hill Avenue. So it's a pretty small district. It's just along Portsmouth Avenue from Bunker Hill Avenue to the traffic circle. And that tends to include a lot of historic properties and buildings that are built pretty close up to the street. And there's currently a requirement in our zoning that for commercial properties, if they abut a residential use or a residential district, that the building be set back at least 100 feet from the road, which is a very high setback. There's no other district in Stratham that has such a high setback. And the planning board didn't feel like it made a lot of sense in this case because a lot of these buildings are already built quite close up to the road. So for example, this amendment was partially due to the owner of the Sweet Dreams Bakery coming to town. And that building is built pretty close up to Portsmouth Avenue. It's approximately 20 feet, might be even a little closer. But the 100-foot requirement, it doesn't allow for redevelopment of properties like that because that building is entirely within that setback requirement. So this amendment, if it were to pass, would allow redevelopments of properties like this which is something that planning would like to encourage. So that's kind of Article 3 in a nutshell. Article 4, as I mentioned previously, this also equates to the gateway zoning district, and it enacts some minimum standards for sidewalks, for commercial driveways, and for electric vehicle charging facilities. So the town has a vision. As I mentioned, we've been working with the New Hampshire Department of Transportation to get a major project in the 10-year plan that would provide sidewalks and bicycle facilities along the corridor. Our vision for the corridor is really one that is more pedestrian oriented, that allows certainly for vehicular traffic, but also allows for other options. So this article, if it were to pass, when a private development comes in, it would require that they build sidewalks up to the town specifications, that they provide facilities for electric vehicles to charge those types of vehicles, and to ensure that driveways are built to certain specifications so that there aren't more than one driveway for small sites, and that the driveway is built so that it's not impeding pedestrian flows along the sidewalk. So that's a little bit of a little bit of a summary of Article 4. Article 5 is a minor housekeeping amendment. It would ensure consistency between two parts of the ordinance. So in this case, there's two parts of the ordinance that talk about the same thing. It's permitted uses in the gateway district. You can find them in the table of uses in our ordinance, as well as in the gateway zoning. And that language, although it's quite similar, some of the terms are a little bit different. So the town wants to ensure that there's consistency between the ordinance, that we're telling a single message about what uses are permitted in the district. So this article, if it were to pass, would accomplish that. Article 6 is based on a new law that was passed by the state legislature last year. That's RSA 674-76. And that law limits the ability of municipalities to regulate land uses for religious uses, or properties that are used primarily for religious uses. So this amendment, it responds to that law by acknowledging its passage, but it also provides a framework so that if a religious use were to be proposed, a religious development, it would still have to go to the planning board. The abutters would still have to be notified. There'd be a process to review that application in a public setting. Even if the town couldn't regulate certain aspects of that development, at least there'd be a public discussion about that in the planning board, and the community would have an opportunity to provide comments to the applicant on those issues that unfortunately the town's not able to regulate as a result of this law. That's Article 6. Article 7 establishes some maximum density requirements, so maximum residential density requirements for the town's commercial districts. So this is something we're seeing more interest in as the real estate market becomes quite heated. We're seeing more interest in developing residentially in our commercial corridors. And currently there's nothing on the books that limits the density of residential development in those areas. There is, we do have kind of a natural built-in kind of guardrail for density because we don't have infrastructure that supports really high densities. But we wanted to ensure that we had some kind of minimum guardrails in place so that when we see these proposals, they'd have to meet those maximum density requirements. So in this case, the requirements are quite a bit more generous than what you see in the residential districts. So we're not discouraging residential development necessarily. We're just trying to create some guardrails in these residential districts, or in these commercial districts, when we do see residential development proposed. That's Article 7. Article 8 would include some legal amendments to our sign ordinance. This is really a housekeeping amendment. It responds to some legal decisions, most notably a Supreme Court decision, which restricts the ability of municipalities or others that regulate signage to regulate the content of the sign. So the courts have said that we can regulate the size of the sign, how the signage is illuminated, how large the sign is. We can't regulate the content of the sign, so the language that appears on the sign. The courts have ruled that that is protected free speech. So this amendment, if it were to pass, just incorporates some amendments to our ordinance without changing the requirements, just to ensure that we're not regulating that content that appears on your signage. Article 9 is very similar. It also deals with the sign ordinance, and it would accomplish everything that Article 8 is asking of the town. But this one is much larger in scope, so we've broken this out into 2 amendments, depending on how voters feel. They can choose one of the 2. If they were to pass this amendment, it would be a complete overhaul of the ordinance, and it would enact some greater regulation on the size, the height, and the illumination of signage in Stratham to ensure that it's not obtrusive, that the signage is consistent with our rural characteristics. So for example, that photo thankfully is not in Stratham, but part of the reason towns have sign ordinances is to control signage from becoming really obtrusive and really distracting for motorists. So Stratham, like almost every town around us, has a sign ordinance, and the planning board looked at our sign ordinance and found that it's really out of step with a lot of our surrounding towns, which have quite a bit stricter requirements. So part of this amendment is really to bring Stratham closer to current period and more consistent with our surrounding communities in terms of how we regulate signage. I also have a photo of political signage. I just want to note that this amendment, if it were to pass, would not regulate political signage. That's something the state legislature regulates, so this has no effect on that. So you'll continue to see quite a bit of political signage during those periods. But this amendment would affect all other forms of commercial signage. And I'll get into some of the changes that are proposed in the next slide here. Still see the top 2 photos there are some signs you see along the Portsmouth Avenue corridor in Stratham. Those are quite tall, large signs. This amendment requires signage to be more kind of pedestrian oriented in height, so that as you're driving by, it's easier to read the content of the signage. These kind of large, taller signs are more oriented for traffic coming from far away. We also think that lower height signage is more aesthetically pleasing. It's more consistent with the town's character. So if this amendment were to pass, it would limit signage height to no more than 12 feet in our main commercial districts. And in some other districts, even a little bit lower than that. But that's kind of the gist of that change. And then you'll see that photo, that nighttime photo that's not in Stratham, kind of the best photo I could describe to show you the impact of some of the illumination changes we're proposing. So Stratham currently allows signs to be internally illuminated. So the lighting source from the sign can be from within the sign. And the town is proposing to change that. We still allow signage to be lit, but it would have to be illuminated by a light source that is unique from the sign, from above the sign, illuminating the content below. As well, there are some what I would consider loopholes in our ordinance, which allows for 2 signs along certain sites. So this would eliminate that. So you really only have 1 sign unless there was a special circumstance. So if you have frontage along 2 different roads, you could have a second sign. We're trying to eliminate situations where there's 2 signs for a single use. So that would make that change. As I mentioned, this is a overhaul of the entire ordinance. So there are some other changes that I can't describe in this format, but if you have questions, my contact information is at the end of this presentation. That's kind of Article 9 in a nutshell. And the final amendment, Article 10, makes a fairly minor change to our solar energy systems zoning. The town's seen a lot of interest lately in implementing solar projects. And the town currently has a requirement that for larger ground mounted facilities, the town takes a financial guarantee for the life of the project. So as long as that solar facility is in place, which could be many decades, to ensure that once the solar facilities are no longer utilized, that the panels are removed from the property and the site's restored to its previous condition. In this amendment, if it were to pass, it would still have that requirement, that would still be required in the zoning that panels be removed once the facilities are no longer in place. But to remove that requirement, that the town hold the financial guarantee for the life of the project. This is something that some residents in town, residents of the Stratham Green development, proposed to the planning board. That development has a solar facility, and the town is holding a financial guarantee, and there's some feeling that was a bit of a hardship. So this would take away that financial guarantee requirement. It would add some language requiring other safeguards in place. The town satisfied that the panels will be removed once the facilities are no longer in use. That's Article 10, the final article you'll see on the ballot this year. I hope this was a bit informative. My name again is Mark Connors. If you have any questions, please reach out to me by email at mconnors@strathamnh.gov or by phone via the contact information below. Thank you. It's great to be with you. And David Moore, the town administrator, is up next.